Hello, my name is Todd R. Yarbrough. I'm a clinical assistant professor at Pace University, and this is my presentation, Beyond Supply and Demand, Sustainability as Economic Principles. The problem as I see it is that economics as a discipline severely limits its usefulness to our existential, social, political, environmental problems by relying upon a first principles curriculum, which is extremely out of date. It's out of date both in the context of the society around us. It's also out of date within the context of economics itself. As a result, not only does this limit the usefulness of economics into the discussion of solutions to these problems, it also creates a general perception amongst the population that economics is the problem as opposed to being a part of the solution. The stakes are extremely high. The majority of students who ever take an economics course will only take economic first principles, and the number of students who take economic first principles is a very large number. This 40% figure is from a 2000 study. That number is almost assuredly larger. I've seen some estimates which put it at above 50% today. The fact is that because students will only take one class in economics, this makes that one class extremely important. And if there are pressing social, political, and environmental issues that need to be addressed by society, by failing to address those in an economic first principles course, what we are essentially doing is removing economic insights from those issues for the majority of college students, which I don't think is a good thing. And it's true. The truth is that the modern college student cares about these issues more than economics, I believe, understands. And so what is going to occur, and what I believe is already occurring to some extent, is that economics is seen as an out-of-date, overly theoretical problem, as opposed to being a discipline which has a wide array of potential insights into these issues, which I believe is the case. I think there are four main problems that got us to this point. The first is a reliance on the classical neoclassical paradigm at the economic first principles level. The truth is that for the vast majority of mainstream economists, such as myself, we don't really think about the economy as classical or the neoclassical paradigm. We've really moved on from that. But because the classical and neoclassical paradigm presents easily understandable theories, we still rely upon those theories to teach economic first principles. Again, this is a problem, despite the fact that almost no economist believes that we shouldn't care about the environment. It's if you poll economists, economists say the environment is a crucial issue in the economic system. A lot of people don't believe that to be the case. So economists are generally seen as being anti-environment, when in fact that's not at all the mainstream economic view. Economic first principles also assumes a big earth view. That is to say that virtually no time is given to resource concerns within economic first principles, and the environment and its resources are seen as mere inputs into a production function, either a country's production function or a firm's production function. In economic first principles, there's a shockingly small amount of actual economic research. There are certainly examples and anecdotal stories that fill textbook chapters, but the actual important economic research, which in recent years has absolutely turned to more social, political, and environmental issues, is largely absent from first principles. So again, student perception of economic first principles is that it's not a concern. And so if you're concerned about social issues, you're going to go need to take a sociology class. First off, you should take a sociology class, but it's sad that it takes a sociology class to be the only one that might talk about those particular issues like income inequality or racial bias in labor markets, for example. Economics is also an extremely siloed discipline, and economics first principles as a concept is really presented in a self-contained way and treats the economy as if it is a separate thing from the human experience, which is, bizarre when you think about it, but we sort of come away from economic first principles, again, seeing the human experience as being a mere outcome of the economic system, and then a surprisingly small amount of concern for what those outcomes might actually be. right? There's a certain happenstance that is given to the human conditions of our economic system, and this is obviously problematic for multiple reasons. The classical problem is basically that economic first principles is founded on a bunch of things that economists don't really believe anymore. Supply side myopia, drawing largely from Say's law, which said that supply created demand. This isn't anything that people believe anymore, except that still shows up as a sort of philosophical concept in first principles. Economists don't really see the economic system from a laissez-faire perspective anymore. There certainly are economists who tend to favor quote unquote freer markets over regulated markets, but the fact is that laissez-faire is actually something that economists spend very little time discussing, and it rarely comes up. So again, that it's situated so centrally to economic first principles doesn't make a whole lot of sense. The circular flow view of how the economic system works, which I have presented here, is extremely dishonest. It's not self-contained. There's all sorts of things flying out of the system, but this is how we teach it. And then the Malthusian conceit. So when issues of sustainability and environmental issues are brought into the classroom, which is usually very little in an economic first principles course, we may bring up, say, someone like Thomas Malthus and the Malthusian catastrophe, the issue that food distributional concerns will be made problematic by population growth. And then economics does this funny thing where they go, well, but then the Industrial Revolution happened, so Malthus was wrong. Right. Of course, ignoring the fact that there's a litany of food distributional concerns in the year 2020. Right. This is not a historical problem. This is a modern problem. And by basically hand waving the Malthusian catastrophe away, we've completely removed economic first principles from conversations about food distribution or water conservation, which when you think about the crucialness of those resources to an economic system, it's actually quite bizarre. The neoclassical situation is a little bit more nuanced, although ultimately ends up not being good either. There are a lot of concepts that were generated by the quote unquote marginal revolution, which is where we get the neoclassical paradox from. Paradox, that's funny, paradigm. Economists like Alfred Marshall, Arthur Pigou, Paul Samuelson, these economists certainly generated a lot of analysis which acknowledged the unsustainable nature of markets and the potential for being unsustainable, but they're really, again, set aside. They're not made central. Market failures are taught as an exception and markets are taught as the rule, which is obviously problematic. There's also a reliance upon mathiness in economics. And I think this has a psychological effect on students where when they see that economists see everything as units and dollars, that this reduces the humanity that students may treat economics. And again, instead of being able to see economics as this tool of social progress, it's seen as an analysis which boils away the humanity of us, which is obviously very problematic. And then the other problem is the pathology of positivism. This is that we teach students in economic first principles from like day one. There's positivist and there is normativism. Right? And we want you to stay as much in the positivism world, and we want you to stay away from normativism. But normativism, of course, is where the modern student puts a lot of their intellectual time. And so by ignoring that world, by not addressing so-called moral questions of the economic system, we are clearly going to fall out of favor with the modern student. And we should want to be in those discussions as well. We should not want to be separated from conversations about, social problems and political and environmental problems. They should be core to why we are economists. The big world view is basically, again, that we see the environment as an input to a national production function. This means that we tacitly rely upon a weak sustainability view. So physical capital is completely substitutable for natural capital. So as long as you're growing the economy, it's okay to cause wide-scale environmental degradation. We know as economists, however, that it would be much preferable if we were in a sustainable development mode. And yet in economic first principles, the notion of sustainable development is almost never talked about. Sustainable development is something that you get to in environmental economics courses, which are 300 level courses. So again, in economic first principles, we're not even having conversations about carrying capacity. We're not really having conversations about the drastic reduction in resources that is required to have the economic system that we have. And so this is, means that economics therefore is removed from these topics and removed from these conversations, and students have to go take environmental studies. Again, they should take environmental studies, but they should also take into those environmental studies classes things they learned in economic first principles that relate to those, as opposed to, again, seeing those two issues as being siloed from each other. Again, the fact is that amongst economists, these issues are incredibly important. And amongst economists, the world is very applied. It's a very empirical world. But first principles is not. First principles is still very theoretic. This is clearly a friction that tends to be problematic. You need theory. The theory is very important. But I think by presenting theory along with not presenting the empirical findings, we're not really teaching students what economics is. We're teaching students what economics was, which again is problematic. This is the top 10 economics journals listed by impact factor. 7 of the 10 here routinely publish papers on environmental issues. So it's a known thing in the field of economics that environmental issues is a very, very important topic. And you see papers published all the time on environmental issues. So the fact that we don't teach these issues in economic first principles is pretty bizarre. And by the way, there's all sorts of other social issues that show up in economics journals that never make it into first principles. So beyond environmental issues, income inequality, workplace bias, labor conditions in developing countries, you talk about these in upper level econ courses, but very little time is given to those topics in economic first principles. And again, remember, most students are not going to take upper level econ courses, so they're not going to be exposed to the insights that econ has in those areas. And then, like I said, economics is very siloed. Economists themselves are now becoming more interdisciplinary in their research, which needs to then move over into economic first principles. I actually think that a way forward, and I'll talk about this, is to take economics classes and make them inherently interdisciplinary, right? If economics is a siloed discipline, then we should unsilo it immediately. So here are just some general steps. Step 1, ditch the circular flow as it is traditionally taught. This is a circular flow that I show to my students. 2 things. First, it shows the inherent foundational political, legal, economic structures, right? It doesn't just treat production and consumption as ethereal. They come from a place. The other thing is that this circular flow is more honest in that it illustrates the concern of spillovers, negative externalities, resource exhaustion. Again, things that absolutely should be foundational to our conversation about economic first principles. We should not separate markets from market failures. The way we teach markets is that markets are the rule, market failures are the exception. I think, teaches students that market failures are somehow this thing that happens sometimes. The truth is that in the modern consciousness of, say, climate change, almost all production and consumption require CO2 emissions. CO2 emissions then cause climate change. So it's likely the case that almost all markets have negative externalities associated with them, which would imply that almost all markets are market failures. So it really makes no sense to teach markets and market failures as 2 distinct things, right? We should just teach markets and also teach alongside that there are negative and positive spillovers to markets, that it's extremely rare for a market to be self-contained. There's almost always positive or negative spillovers in other areas, environmental problems being a clear case of that. Almost no time in economic first principles is ever given to the notion of environmental justice. Again, if you're going to have a conversation about economic growth and the ability of growth to generate human prosperity, then environmental justice needs to be a part of that conversation. Otherwise, again, you're being very dishonest, because the fact is that economic growth has created environmental burdens which fall primarily on low-income individuals, to the extent that there is very little environmental justice in a market-based economic system. That needs to be required on the policy side, unless we start to have conversations about how maybe we can structure our economic system to embed environmental justice into it. We clearly haven't come anywhere close to that so far, and maybe perhaps that's because we've never really talked about it in an economic first principles course before. The good thing is that economics has a plethora of ideas and concepts which could be beneficial to sustainability. And so what I propose is that sustainability be an economic principle. So instead of teaching economic principles and then say, well, here's how sustainability may fit into that, what I'm suggesting is that sustainability become an economic principle. That you cannot separate economic systems from the need to keep them sustainable. And sustainability in the context of issues like income inequality, labor conditions, resource usage, and environmental degradation. The great thing is that economics has a bunch of ideas. So diminishing marginal returns, trade-offs and opportunity costs, rationality, mutual benefits, and the problem of information, the need of society, or the tendency of society to form social contracts to smooth over the rougher edges of economic growth, whether that's through environmental policy or whether that's through social policy writ large. Also, the idea that as uncertainty goes up over issues, we should actually take more precaution. Economic first principles sort of teaches students that, well, because environmental issues are sort of this, they're outside of it, they're kind of separated from economics, right? But we know that there's all this uncertainty as to what the future cost of environmental damages are actually going to be. They are probably going to be huge, but they could be even bigger than we expect. And therefore, the precautionary principle needs to be brought into economic first principles. We should teach foundationally in economic first principles the precautionary principle as a part of sustainability as an economic first principle. And then we need to de-silo economics, break up the old boys club of economics. This has been very slow. Economics in recent years has been called out, thankfully, for its lack of diversity, and that is changing. However, I think that economic first principles is still a course which does very little to diversify economics. I think that, truthfully, if you look at the way economic first principles has historically been taught, it's a very Western-centric, anthropocentric view of, the human experience. One that I think, again, is a very incomplete story. And so bringing in sociology, poli-sci, history, environmental issues is necessary. And by the way, these disciplines have been talking about economics for a long time. So we, should repay the favor. Economics is useful, but it has to be made so, right? Far too long economists have relied upon economics is everywhere. Yeah, okay, but have you noticed that economics also doesn't really have a place at the table in the conversation of a lot of these issues? And if it does, it's seen as inherently a bad thing by a lot of other disciplines, which is highly problematic. And so economics should be less insular. We should be more open to why this has occurred. And I think that begins with changing our first principles curricula to reflect the fact that we want to remain relevant, okay? And you can't remain relevant while teaching irrelevant ideas. So we got to get away from the irrelevant ideas. We have to be more honest about what those irrelevant ideas have wrought upon society. And we should have much more honest conversations about, the way in which economic, political, and environmental systems, produce the human experience that we see globally. And again, both within the context of the way students see it, then also the way that the general population sees it, which is, clearly a function of how students see it as well.